side. Okay, we're recording. So hopefully I didn't freak everybody out, but my goal is always to make sure that we are weeks ahead when I make the Canvas weeks live. And so I just made a bunch of weeks live for you all, and I hope that was not stress inducing. Nothing is due immediately. We're still following the pattern. We've got reading this week and then a discussion board post at the end. But you can see what is coming up in the next few weeks. So week 6, we're following the same pattern, week 7. But then week 9, you have the first big assignment due for me. So that is why I wanted to make sure all the weeks up to then were live and that I have the prompts up for these assignments. So anybody that wants to get started early can start it. And in this week, especially, we want you to just start thinking about this big assignment. So it's the big racism in nursing research assignment, right? I'm going to have you, I'm not just going to give you a prompt and like have you go write. No, we're going to write a rough draft, but it's a very structured rough draft. So it's not just, hey, write 5 pages or anything like that. It's answer specific questions that when you answer them the way I've outlined it, you should have what will equal a rough draft that you can use as a blueprint for that final draft, right? So it's going to be very structured, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time in class in the next few weeks talking about it. So we'll take it one step at a time, and then the final draft is not due until towards the end of October. If you go under assignments, you see final draft and racism, it's not due until, oh, did I put the wrong date? Let me double check that real quick. Maybe not. I'm like, let me double check midnight. Oh, I'm looking at the wrong syllabus. Okay, no, it's correct. So it's not even due till November. So that's good. So between the rough draft and the final draft, you have almost a month. So the rough draft's due in October. That's why I had gotten mixed up. It's due October 23rd, and then the final draft's November 20th. So I spaced this out purposefully so that it gives you time to revise and to think through some of the issues, right? So what are these drafts? So let's start with just the final draft. What's the final project you're going to have to submit for me? Wait, why is it? I'm like, why is it not letting me see it? Like, I know it's published because it's visible here. Okay, I'm going to leave student view right now, and then I'm going to double check the settings to make sure it's visible. But this is the final assignment you're going to submit to me. It is a 6 to 8 page paper in which you analyze the experiences of nurses of color as they described them in 2021 in interviews. So I'm going to provide you with a collection of interviews, or rather, they're on a website where specialists in oral history conducted interviews with about 40 different nurses who self-identified as people of color and discussed their experience in nursing, discussed it from the time they were in school through several decades, some of them of experience within the nursing field, and some of them even talk about their experiences as patients, how that has affected their work in nursing and just their overall experience with racism in the field, right? I'm not giving you a question to answer in this assignment because I want you to develop your own thesis. Right. While the main topic of each interview is racism, within the topic of racism, there are many things, subtopics that you can choose. So I want you to actually make a choice about what topics in those discussions are interesting to you and to develop a thesis around those topics. Right. And we will work on that, and we work on how one develops a thesis with a project like that. But you will be allowed to focus on an element of the interviews that you are particularly interested in. Right. So it does mean we have to spend some time with those interviews first and discussing these things, discussing how one works with oral interviews like these. right? They were just done last year. So it also means that there are certain things that certain issues that come up, like, for example, the fact that these interviews were conducted in the middle of a pandemic. That might color the way some responses are. But also there are best practices on how one analyzes interviews. So, okay, this is the final project you submit to me. But like I said before, you're going to have to submit a rough draft before, a very structured rough draft. And let me go into the rough draft prompt. So for the rough draft, what we're doing is, one, I want you to pick which interviews are the most interesting to you, which are the ones that you are most likely to use in your final paper, right? So the first step is going to this website and watching the interviews, right? Picking the ones that speak to you more, that speak on topics that you're interested in. And so right now, this is why I want to present this. Right now, you just want to be aware of this website and maybe start looking through them, not in a great detail, just watching the interviews and seeing which kinds of interviews you are particularly interested in, right? So there's 40 of them here. One of the things that you right away you can try to think that you might be interested in is looking at gender, seeing if there's a specific experience for female nurses versus male nurses that you might want to talk about, for example, if that's something that comes up in the interviews, right? Or you might want to divide some of these interviews based on the ethnicity or the racial identity of the people being interviewed, right? But there's even other subtopics within that, right? Let me go back. So I want you to pick which interviews you want to focus on for your final paper. And I want you in the rough draft to give me summaries of each interview, right? To basically tell me what the person talks about in the interview. Like, what are those topics that interest you? And maybe even pick out quotes from them that you found meaningful. When you do that, that helps you so that you don't have to rewatch those interviews over and over again when you're writing the paper. Right? That's why I'm making you do that for the rough draft, so that you have that already written out. Then I'm going to ask you to answer these 4 questions. And as you see, this is where I basically organize it or structured it so that it's an outline. It's an outline of the things I want you to have in your final draft. Right. So one is to have at least a minimum of a 1-paragraph discussion of the value of the interviews. What good information do they give us? Right. For the second question, I want you to talk about the history that can help us understand these interviews. Right? So you don't actually need to do a ton of research outside of what we're already talking about in class. You can use the readings we've been doing. You can use the lectures where we've talked already about the racist origins of a lot of these medical fields. Right? You can use that. So you don't have to be conducting too much additional research. Now, some of that will depend on what exactly you want to write. You might need to look up other things if we haven't talked about something in class, but that should become clear if you need to do that in the process of writing, of answering these questions, right? For that, I'm going to ask you for 3 to 5 paragraphs, right? But again, even just using the class material, 3 to 5 paragraphs should be easy by the time you get to submitting this. I want you to also consider what the problems are with every single primary source, right? Historians use primary sources to write history. Every single primary source gives us some problems because there's something they're telling us and there's a lot of things they're not telling us. There's biases in the kind of source it is and in the information that it gives us. So I want you to think about that. Diana, this is not due till October 23rd. I'm just presenting the prompt now. And then lastly, I want you to talk about the themes you're going to be writing about. So basically in the process of answering this, you will have a completed rough draft with all the key elements your final draft will need. Right? And we'll be talking about them, right? Like some of this stuff you don't know, you won't inherently know what are all the problems that should be considered when analyzing interviews. We'll be discussing that in class, right? So we're going to go through each step together, and then I'm going to let you go and then kind of write your own ideas, write your own paper based on these interviews, right? So right now for this week, I don't want you to panic about it. Right now, it's just to be aware that this assignment is coming up. Starting next week, we'll be spending time talking about the interviews and maybe watching pieces of them in class together. So just know that this is coming up, and not until October, but it is something that if for some of you, I know you like working ahead of it and you want to start thinking about it and organizing your time. And so in that case, everything you're going to need is already up. Mario, that's an excellent question. Mario's asking how many interviews you need to focus on. I don't care. I really don't think it matters. What matters is what topic interests you and how many interviews you can find on that website that actually touch on those topics. So I don't expect you to include in your paper 40 different interviews. I also don't think it's possible to write this paper and only use one interview. Right? That's too many. I mean, one is too much and the other is not enough interviews. So it will depend on you. It's entirely on you. I don't have a maximum or a minimum. The reality is that when we write a research paper, right, especially if you end up going to a master's program or a PhD program or in an upper division class, the real skill of writing a paper is you making those decisions, you having analyzing the evidence and then choosing what is important and how much of it is important to have in the paper. Right. And so I want you to practice doing that. This is still a structured way of doing it, right? I'm not giving you complete freedom. You don't get to choose your topic. There's a specific website I want you to use. But within that, I'm trying to give you some of the freedom that you would have if you were working independently, which is you get to pick. You get to decide how many interviews you need in order to provide evidence of your argument. But that is an excellent question. Now, why? Let me go to the website. I told you all of these interviews were conducted last year in 2021. You can see, I mean, by looking at it, you can tell some of the individuals interviewed are older, but a lot of them are younger. So these are people that their experiences in nursing are very recent. So let me ask you, why in the world would I have you in a history class analyze such recent interviews? Right? Why do you think I would make this? How is it relating already to some of the things we've been talking about in history, these very recent interviews? I'm asking you to read my mind, but you can hypothesize. Why do you think I would have you do this? Recent history. Yeah. Whenever I ask you all, right, what the value of history is, like why should we study history, right? We always talk about how it helps us understand the present, right? How it can help us understand the present, how it can help us fix problems, how it can help us move forward into the future. Well, if that is true, if that is the value of history, then let's do it. Let's use what we're learning about medical research and the origins of science and racism to analyze the more recent experience of people, right? We want to make sure that we're putting into practice why we believe history is valuable. So that's why this is still a history paper. This is not a social science paper, right? This is not an analysis of just nursing today. No, the point of the project is to take those experiences that we have access to about people in nursing and to put a historical context to it. Talk about how it fits into the history of race and ethnicity in the United States. Right. So this is still a history paper, but this is where, okay, I'm going to assume that most of you don't have an experience doing that. If you do, it's great. You're already a step ahead, but I'm assuming most people don't have experience writing this kind of paper. And that's why we have to take it one step at a time. Right. So no panicking yet. Any other questions though that come up? Some of you might be thinking, not yet, but you will once we get deeper into this assignment. In the meantime, while I'm talking about assignments, let me go back into the assignments page. I'm going to offer an extra credit activity. Some of you might really want this, and others of you might not need it at all. That's okay. If you don't need it at all, you could always do it and kind of save it to apply towards a future assignment. Right? Like if you're thinking like, oh, that racism in nursing assignment really sounds scary. I might need extra credit for that. So you can put these extra credit points towards that. Or you might feel like, oh, well, I already screwed up a couple of discussion board posts. I need the extra credit to go towards that. Totally fine. You can use it towards that. It's this week. There's an event coming up this week. It's a Zoom event. So it's not an in-person event. This Thursday, September 22nd from 6 to 8 p.m. Right. And for to receive 10 points extra credit, you must attend the Zoom event and then write a one-page summary of what you hear at the event, like what the speakers discuss. Right. 10 points might not sound like a lot, but like on a paper that's worth 100 points, 10 points, for example, would make an A- into an A+. Right? Or it would take a B into the A range, right? It could, some of you that might be the points you've lost in the discussion board post. So it will immediately bump your grade up, right? So what you need for this event is the Zoom link, and the Zoom link is in this flyer. They've decided, I don't know why they've done this, and this must make it easier sometimes, but they've decided to embed the link into a QR code. So you're going to need this flyer. And the code that gives you the link to the Zoom is over here in the bottom corner. What is this event? Why is it related to class? Why am I giving you extra credit to attend it? Well, the topic is the Indigenous Garden at Cal State LA. So this is from the Historical Society of Southern California, who is putting this panel together. That's going to feature alumni and current students from Cal State LA's history department. And they're going to be talking about the research that they conducted on California history, the challenges they faced in the process, but especially talking about the garden we have at Cal State LA. Did you all know we have a garden, a student-run garden at Cal State LA? Did anybody know?
No.
Okay, then they'll talk about that as well, right? I don't know exactly what each panelist will say. Some of you did know. Excellent. If you didn't know, then you know, like students work on this, and there are both undergraduate and graduate students that are basing their research on kind of environmental history of California. And particularly, it sounds like the topic that these panelists will focus on is indigenous approaches to gardening. So it relates to the history we're talking about. And I will be at the Zoom listening to it. Your page, the page that you submit for the extra credit, you have to submit it on Canvas on this assignment link, right? So you'll have to come back in here and start assignment and then upload your one-page summary of what the speakers talk about. The one-page summary can be double-spaced. It doesn't have to be single spaced. It can be double spaced. And if you write more, that's totally fine. I just need a minimum of a one-page summary of what you hear to show me that you were there and that you were paying attention, and you get the 10 points extra credit. Right. So again, this is extra credit. It's not required. You don't have to attend. This is outside of class, and it might not even fit with your schedule. And if you're like, I need extra credit, or I want extra credit, and this just doesn't fit, I can't attend. Okay, don't worry. Other opportunities might come up whenever the history department has events, or other events come up in class or in the community that are related to our class. I try to offer them as extra credit. Yeah, there's no due date on it. So you submit it to me whenever you submit to it. I recommend you submit it to me that weekend so that you don't put it off and you don't forget everything about the event. But I don't want to put a due date on it and freak people out. Yeah. So I recommend you submit it Sunday by midnight with the discussion board post. But if you need additional time for it, you can submit it at any point. So does that sound okay? Are there any questions now about the extra credit? No? Cool. Then I do wait for you all to respond. Okay, excellent. So I want to start talking about immigration, right? About 19th century ways of immigration, right? So once we have not even a full established United States, because not every part of what is now the United States was officially part yet, but in the 19th century, we start to have westward expansion. And along with westward expansion comes new waves of immigrants, both on the East Coast and on the West Coast, right? Even as California is not yet part of the United States or the American Southwest, it is kind of, it will be. And so we need to talk about what is happening over there, right? Over there, like over here where we're at now. So to start talking about that, we're going to start by talking about Irish immigration and focus on the reading that I signed for today. To start thinking about it, I want to play you a TikTok video. This is somebody I found on TikTok. She is a critical race theory expert. So sometimes I get questions about if this class is critical race theory, and I always say, like, academically speaking, no, this class is not critical race theory. Critical race theory was not something I was trained in or something I am an expert in. It is something that is taught in law schools. Well, she is actually a critical race theorist, an expert on it. She, the person I'm going to, who made the video I'm going to play, went to law school and has practiced law and is an expert on these topics. But she uses history as she's explaining something. So this is not necessarily a video that is a critical race theory video necessarily, but she's having a discussion of race and ethnicity, and especially of whiteness, right? Because when we talk about race and ethnicity in this class, but in society in general, oftentimes we discuss the other, right? Different groups that are not white and how they fit into the fabric of US history and and American society. Well, that still makes the default whiteness. Why is whiteness always the default? And also, if it is, regardless of whether we want it to be or not, there should still be a discussion of what is that whiteness, what it requires of us. Some of this we've already started talking about, and the reading just delved a little bit deeper into it. So as I play this video, it's a short because it's a TikTok video, it's short. I want you to think about what she's talking about you agree with, and what you have questions about, what you might not agree with. We don't have to agree with everything that is said in this video, right? But we want to explore it. I think it'll help us discuss this issue of Irish immigrants and the history of their assimilation in the United States. So I'll play this. If there's any problem with the audio, if you can't hear, if it's too loud, let me know in the chat, but then we'll talk about this afterwards. So let me play it.
So I've had a few people like message me and ask if I can talk more about the kinds of things that whiteness has robbed people who identify as white of. And there are so many things. First of all, I think it's really important to think about the ways in which whiteness has robbed white people of identity. And what I mean by that is your ancestors were not white. Your ancestors were Scottish, were Irish, were Italian, right? They had to sacrifice that in order to become white. They had to sacrifice the heritage and the customs and the names and the language in order to assimilate into a society that told them that they were not white, they were not valuable. And I don't say that lightly. The 1790 Naturalization Act literally said in order to be eligible for citizenship, you had to be a free white person. There's a whole history of white people changing their last names to sound more American and less Irish, for example, right? And that, in fact, people who were Irish weren't even considered white at first. And so whiteness has required you to sacrifice part of your identity in order to be seen as part of the in group. And because of that, there is this gnawing void that white people struggle with, not only building community, authentic, genuine community with other people, even other people who identify as white, but also knowing yourself. And this is one of the reasons they don't have difficulty appropriating other people's culture, cosplaying people's culture, because they're looking to fill that void. But even that, like, to me, that even pales in comparison to the fact that I've seen parents throw out their children for dating someone of a different race. Like, that's what whiteness demands of you. It demands the kind of loyalty that you would kick out your own children, right, for dating somebody outside of their race. A whole thing that's made up. Like, that's what that's the kind of loyalty whiteness requires of you. You have foregone authentic relationships. There is so much that BIPOC communities have to offer that either they refuse to or they cannot because of the construct of whiteness. And those contributions are things white people could benefit from too, but they're not able to because they are wedded to this illusion of whiteness that has already robbed them of that identity I was talking about, often of meaningful connection with their own family, because they have to be more loyal to whiteness than they can to their own family, but also of the opportunity to form meaningful community with people in this society who aren't white, because whiteness exacts that kind of price. It is not working for you either.
Okay, let me stop that. And so let me ask you, what are your reactions? What do you think? Do you think she has a point? Do you think, do you want to disagree with it? What are your reactions on hearing that? Oh, Robert has in the chat. So this is something I talk a lot about. He says, example, my kids had a project at school where they had to bring a culture box that represented their culture. We literally have no culture beyond cheeseburgers, Spider-Man, colonialism, genocide. So that's an interesting thing, right? Because at first I thought, my first instinct when I heard that video, I was like, but wait a minute. We have hybrid identities. It's something that's actually really unique in world history. This idea that you can be like for myself, that I can be Mexican American, right? These hybrid identities exist. So it's like, so people can be Irish American, Italian American, Scottish American. But it does seem like the longer people have been in the country, the more that is lost. Like after generations of it, for a lot of people, that some of that cultural background, cultural origins do seem to get lost in order for assimilation to happen, or as assimilation happens. Do you think it's something that it seems like it demands, Americanness demands that you let go of that cultural identity? Michael says, pretty accurate. The US had to define what white was when they began to create demographic studies, especially in terms when they had quotas for immigration from the UK as opposed to Eastern Bloc countries. That's true. So I find it interesting how even people considered white today weren't even considered as such back then. Then it really sort of highlights the concept of whiteness as superior. Yes, and that's the thing, one of the things that I find valuable in that video, that it can help us think through like this idea of the Irish were not white, because today no one would call the Irish not white, right? But okay, if they were not white and now they are, then okay, there's something interesting happening there. How did that occur? Because that gives us the key then to defining whiteness and defining the other. And actually looking at the example of the Irish, and especially in contrasting them with the example of Chinese immigrants, we'll see the stark contrast in what is allowed, what does whiteness require, and what is it absolutely not, what it is it deciding it is not, right? So I wanted to start there and talk about the reading, right? Because the reading presented the information of Irish immigration in a way that can help us decide, if this is something we agree or not. Right. And it starts going back to Ireland as a colony, right? Because we already talked about, for example, how the Irish were used by the English as kind of the point of comparison when they come across indigenous people, right? They already have a vocabulary in which people that they call savages and wild, which for the English was the Irish, right? And that goes to a long history of treating Ireland like a colony, right? We can really be called a very early English colony, right? So do you remember how the Irish were treated as a colony on the reading? Oh, someone's putting it in here. Yes, so Brianna's saying, I believe that she's correct because the U.S. signifies as white when other people come to this country and have to be restricted by the orders. Yeah. So, and this is the problem, right? When the Irish began coming to the U.S. in significant numbers, right? They're not unknown to even to the population of English people that were already in here. There's already a relationship, and the problem was, and the reason they're not considered white is because there was already a relationship between the English and the Irish. It was that of a colony, of English oppression in Ireland, right? The Irish were looked down upon and viewed as less than. They were being treated with discrimination, right? Yeah, so we'll talk about this idea of the absence of culture too. So one, how the Irish were oppressed and discriminated against by the English. The English arrive into Ireland, right? We're talking about two different islands in what we might now call the UK. And they start buying up land, taking Irish land, right? And the problem there, or what we see really clearly, is that in early modern European, and also this is all over Europe, but a process land was communal, right? So you might not own a piece of land. One of the lords or dukes might own it, but it's a large piece of land, and people had rights. Peasants had rights to the land, that even if it was not owned by them, a right to use it to graze grazing for animals, right? So if you have cattle or other farming animals, they need to eat. They're eating grass. So for that, you need chunks of land where there's plenty of grass. There were these communally designated pieces of land where peasants and anybody in the community could go and use, or small plots of land could be used for small gardening, farming, to provide food for peasant families. Right. So this is the way in which peasants basically survived, and it was possible to survive under a feudal system. Well, as the feudal system collapsed, one of the things we see is the idea of land ownership arise. And if you're going to own land, that means the land cannot be communal. It cannot be used by just anybody. The peasants have to lose access to the land. That was already happening in France and England and what is now Germany. And it begins being forced on the Irish by the English, because they're coming in, they're purchasing land or taking land, and they start, fencing it. So land that was communal, that people had access to before, all of a sudden they no longer have access to. Right? Now, some of the Irish still had farms, right? If they had chunks of land that could be designated as theirs, could be legally theirs, then the English didn't have any right to them. But as the British come to dominate and be in control of Ireland, they dictate that Irish farmers have to sell their produce. They have to sell everything they farm to the English. This is a huge problem because, one, now they don't get a choice in what happens to the product of their work, but it also means that it's going to cause starvation in Ireland because all of the food is being shipped to England, right? Because the English feel like they need food. They've already used up a lot of their resources and they need food. So they're forcing the Irish to farm and export everything to England and not keep enough to feed the Irish. So it's starvation, not because there's a lack of food, but because of this economic oppression, right? That the English are forcing the Irish to starve by taking all of the food that is being grown in Ireland. So as a result, in the early 1800s, you have these initial waves of immigration from Ireland to the United States. They're coming because they've lost access to land, they're starving, the economic situation is so bad that people are choosing to leave. Right now, some people are leaving Ireland and going to like Scotland and England, Wales, they're going to places nearby. But the economies there are also not able to support a large influx of Irish migrants. So what a lot of Irish migrants decide is that they're going to try their luck overseas in the Americas. So a lot of them begin coming to what is now the United States and to Canada, primarily arriving on the East Coast, right? Those are some of the first waves of Irish immigrants that come to the US. The second or later, the largest wave of Irish immigrants we know come because of the potato famine, right? Now the potato is a really interesting crop. It was not original to Eurasia, right? The potato was an American crop. It was being farmed by native populations in the Americas, but it is exported. There's a couple of places where it grows very nicely, and Ireland was one of those places. It grows nicely. In addition, the potato provides a lot of calories, right? And it was cheap to grow. It didn't require as much water and as much taking care of as other crops. And so a lot of Irish farmers immediately switched to the potato. Right? They can sell it, but they can also keep enough at home. And that basically prevents the family from starving because the potato has enough calories to keep you going. Right? By the way, it's also like there are a lot of things in in Europe that are not possible until the coming together of the whole world or the Americas being integrated into the global economy. And the potato is one of those things. The other one, another big one is like the tomato. So there are a lot of things we now associate with like Europeans that they needed the Americas for, but that's a side comment. So the potato, we know the potato famine occurs because a lot of potato crops fail. There's a plague. It destroys the potato farms, and it means now no food, nothing to sell. It leaves people feeling like there is no other option but to emigrate. Right. And so that is the period between 1855 and 1900 in which somewhere around 2 million Irish immigrants arrive in the United States. Right? And how are they treated when they arrive in the United States? Do they find a land full of opportunities and unlimited ability to make wealth and to thrive? Because that was part of how they saw it, right? They're coming to America where they've heard from sometimes other family, how great it is. You can find a job. There's a possibility of owning land. Is that what the Irish find when they come to the US? Yeah, they're cheap, exploited labor. And part of it is they're arriving on the East Coast of what is now the United States in port cities, places like New York and Boston. Right, that's where the largest concentration of Irish immigrants end up landing. Right, they're coming through Ellis Island. If you've had any U.S. history, you know that story. But when they arrive, they're immigrants that are coming in with no money, Oftentimes they're literally arriving with just what they can carry with them. And they're coming over with families, right? So immediately it's time to put everybody to work, right? And are they gonna be able to find luxury housing accommodations? No, right? Because one, lack of money. And so they're going to be forced to build their own communities in cities like Boston and New York that end up being low income and can be described as slums. Though we'll later talk about how slums don't just exist; they are created, and how they're created. It has nothing to do with who's living there. It's decisions being made in local government, but they end up living in low-income housing that is not desirable. Oftentimes, more than one family per room, per house. If you're lucky, it's just your family in one house, but potentially might be more people depending on the situation, right? So it's a hard life, a hard reality of what it is to come to the United States. They're cheap labor, and they're oftentimes competing with Black and Chinese workers for jobs, right? And that is one of the places in the workforce in which they're encountering ideas about race, right? Because white workers were oftentimes being paid much significantly more than Black or immigrant workers, right? So right away, the Irish come in and they're not white, right? So they're not going to get the same kind of paycheck that a white worker will get. So now they're competing with Black workers and Chinese workers for hard labor jobs, right? And they very clearly see the hierarchy, right? White workers get better treatment. They have more rights. They have access to citizenship, right? Whereas even for Black and Chinese workers, that doesn't exist, right? They're clearly being treated as second-class citizens with not even rights to vote, make decisions, right? And they're getting paid less. So looking at that hierarchy, if for the first time you're being confronted with these ideas, where do you want to be in the hierarchy, right? If you're the Irish immigrants and you see this, whiteness at the top, Black and foreign at the bottom, then where do you want to be? You want to be at the top, right? You're like, wait, how do I get over there? Now everybody's kind of looking at this. Chinese workers will also look at the same dynamic and think, wait, how do we get up there where there are more rights and more respect and better pay? For the Irish, the decision is largely clear. And this is not for every single Irish immigrant, but largely the decision they make is they're adopting a racist and anti-Black idea, right? They're like, aha, well, if white people feel like Black people are inferior, then we should feel that way too and make a claim to whiteness, right? But what does it take to get that claim to whiteness? Well, one, we see certain things like language, right? The Irish are coming in and they must learn to speak English, right? This seems to be one of the requirements. So they let go of the Irish language, right? And this has massive implications, right? And it's part of the reason, although the English have a lot of it to do, why you can travel to Ireland today and do perfectly fine without knowing Irish. More than perfectly fine. It's the spoken language, right? But so it's adopting anti-Black attitudes, learning the language, and then you need access to citizenship. Now, some of this doesn't happen overnight, right? The initial waves of Irish immigrants don't have time to learn English, right? You learn what you can on the job to get by, but if you're working long hours from sun up till sundown, you don't have time to learn English, really. It's the next generation. It's the second generation of Irish immigrants that are going to be the ones who, because they came here young enough or because they were born in the US, then they're going to grow up learning the language. They're the ones that are going to have full access to that whiteness, right? In addition, once you become eligible for citizenship, right? Which the Irish do. They are not prevented from becoming citizens. And especially once the second and third generations of Irish immigrants are born, right, of those initial families are born in the US, and they automatically receive access to citizenship. That allows for political power to be built, right, to be built. And once you have political power, you can also influence like those laws that allow you Irish immigrants to become citizens, and that allow for more rights and more power, more control for these Irish communities to have. And they become really powerful, right? In places like New York and Boston, the Irish population will become politically dominant. And when they're politically dominant, right, it equals an assimilation process has occurred, right? And an adoption of racist ideas has occurred. So they go hand in hand, right? These things are happening at the same time, that the more successful you become, the more access you become to whiteness, and also like the more assimilated you have become as well. Right. And then they also come to monopolize trades. The reading talks about how then all of a sudden there are certain jobs that can only be held by Irish immigrants or descendants of in these Irish communities, and because they have the numbers, they can control things like that. They can control trades and political machines. So the story of the Irish, although it does not happen overnight, is a story of success. They successfully assimilate into American culture, and therefore also into whiteness, right? Now, the video talked about things had to be sacrificed. So if we look at the Irish specifically, what are they sacrificing in order to assimilate and become American? You'll know the answer. You can tell me what are they giving up in order to be assimilated?
Their culture.
A large chunk of their culture. Maintaining ties back with Ireland is one difficult. It's not like you can just, send an email, make a phone call. There was some contact back home, but what ends up happening is instead of maintaining contact with family back home is more likely to migrate to the United States once the first family is established, right? Like if maybe I don't want to be the first to go to the Americas, then my cousin goes. But then once I see that my cousin's doing all right, then I might choose to go, right? This is the same pattern for most immigrant groups. But yeah, that means the connection back to Ireland is not being kept, right? There was some of culture kept via festivals, and we still have, like, why do we celebrate St. Patrick's Day? Well, it's because of these significant waves of Irish immigrants, but a lot of it is largely being sacrificed, right? A lot of those connections are not being kept. Their language, yes, Brian, for sure. The language, you're not going to find Irish Americans who are speaking Irish anymore. They're not, right? After that first generations of migrants die, that language is completely lost. Yeah. Now, do you think the process of assimilation looks different in every time period? So we can make some comparisons to today. Do you think assimilating into Americanness today, does it still require the same things? Would it require giving up your culture and original language? What do you think, just based on what you've seen, what you've lived? Aha, Robert, I'm like, this is where it gets complex. I think in some, like, you do see, like, right, some of you have family members that came to the US in like the 80s, well, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And those are people that were most likely to not want to speak Spanish, not publicly and not at home. So they're most people that were likely to have assimilated in terms of language and choose actually to not speak the original language. But more recently, my experience, for example, in Southern California was I don't have to give up Spanish in order to consider myself American, but that hasn't always been the case, and it's not the case necessarily everywhere. And depends on the family. Yeah, it depends on the family, right? In my family, we spoke Spanish at home. Once my siblings and I got older, we transitioned more to Spanglish, but growing up, we always spoke Spanish at home, English at school, right? But that was possible, I think, in Southern California, where there were a significant number of immigrants with the same experience, where I could, like with my friends growing up, I could speak Spanish with them. If I had grown up in, I don't know, let's pick on Utah or in Kansas, would I have had the same experience? Probably not. Probably not. In places where, even if there is a community of whatever the immigrant group is, because it's such a smaller minority in comparison to everyone else, the experience tends to be different. Yeah, like my sister, for example, had a hard time when my family moved to Kansas. They moved when she was little. She was used to bilingual education, and they thought that they needed to like hold her back a grade and things like that just because of her English. As a result, though, she knows Spanish, my youngest sister, but she is not comfortable speaking it. She knows it. She understands. I can speak to her in Spanish, but she's not as comfortable speaking in Spanish. That's actually in the process of changing because of some of her work stuff. But that tends to be common in places where, okay, if you grow up in places where you don't hear a lot of the native language, then but there's a lot of pressure to not speak it. Right? But yeah, in Jesus brings up an interesting point. In places like California, it's actually now you see an opposite trend where there's a lot of shaming of Latinos for not speaking Spanish. Right, the no sabo kids, like there's nothing wrong with being a Latino and not speaking Spanish. There's specific reasons why that occurred. There's no need to shame people about it. But I see a lot more of that culturally happening. Embarrassed to be themselves. Yes, there was things. There was a discussion recently I saw online of that, right? About how, especially in professional settings, is where a lot of us or a lot of immigrants feel like they have to code switch and basically not be 100% themselves in professional settings, right? Because some things are not accepted, right? It's not accepted to bring your ethnic looking clothes if you work in a business setting. I think that might be a little bit different in Southern California, but typically people are going to be like, well, that's weird. And if you break that norm, you can do that, right? You can break the norm, but then you know what you're doing. You know, you're breaking a norm, you know, people are going to be asking questions and you need to be willing to confront that or experience that, right? One of the things for me was hoop earrings. I like wearing big like earrings. Right now, today I didn't pick big flashy earrings, but it was very clear when I looked at people who were professional, right, who were working in businesses and even in education, that they tended to not wear jewelry or wear smaller jewelry, studs, things like that. And hoop earrings in particular were seen as too ethnic. That might sound weird to some people. Can anybody explain why hoop earrings might be seen as too ethnic? I'm like, aha, it's actually a good thing if nobody can explain it. Maybe this is something that is going away. But yeah, Emily?
The only thing I can think of is like from a fashion standpoint, lots of Black and brown communities in the 90s popularized hoop earrings, and so that's
Yes, and so it was associated with like being Black and brown and poor. And it was especially the hoop earrings in the 80s and 90s. It was part of like the chola look, right? Like a gangster look. So it was something that's specifically seen as not professional, right? I think some of that is changing because younger people and new generations that didn't live through that are coming up and they're like, I don't care. I'm like, I wear whatever earrings, and they haven't been taught the things that some of us were taught during those decades about what is appropriate and what's not appropriate. But I'm like, but every generation has these things of like, you learn, even sometimes just by watching, right? The way somebody gets treated. Wait, they get yelled at for behaving in this way, in this setting. So I will not do that. Right? That's how the process of assimilation occurs. That's what had occurred, what was happening with the Irish and for a lot of other immigrant groups throughout history, right? Is that you very quickly learn what's allowed, what's not allowed, what kind of jobs you even have access to because of where you come from, right? Anything else? I'm like, this is just a kind of quick talk through some of the reading, but anything else that you picked up on from the reading? So in large part, what we're saying then about the video that I played, the TikTok video, is that she's largely correct then, right? Largely correct. That part of assimilation into whiteness requires giving up language, giving up past and traditions. We'll come back to this idea of what needs to be given up and by which groups, right? But let's move on to talking about the Chinese in the West Coast, right? We got to set up both coasts, and in order to really understand what is happening with the Chinese immigrants and why they will not be allowed to be assimilated into whiteness, they will not be allowed to be included in the definition of whiteness legally. Right? Chinese immigrants will actually legally make the case that they are white. And the courts will say, no, you count as non-white, right? To understand why the treatment is different for these two groups, we understand this idea of Orientalism. This was an idea presented by scholar Edward Said. He wrote this massive book called Orientalism, and he talked about how in the US and in the Western Europe, there's this idea of the Orient. And the Orient was a word that was very popular in like the 19th century. We don't use it anymore most of the time, but it's this idea of to define people from the Middle East and Asia. Those places were labeled as the Orient, right? And they were seen as through prejudice and racism, right? They're seen as backward places, oftentimes unaware of their own like history and culture. Right? So it explains why like the British Museum and the Louvre contain such a large number of artifacts from the Middle East and Asia. They went into these places, colonized, removed all these historical objects because they believe these people that live in these places don't even know how to take care of these objects. They cannot be trusted to preserve their own history. Right? And the idea was widespread, right? That this is a foreign, exotic place, right? Some Americans and Western Europeans were interested in the Middle East and Asia. They were fascinated by it, but the fascination came from a place of prejudice, of like, oh, I'm fascinated in these people because they're so backwards and so different. Right? It's not out of a place of these are equals to me. These are people that I'm interested in their history. No, it's I'm interested in taking and appropriating that history. Right? And what Said has said, this occurred throughout the 18th century, and there's a history of it even before in the way that the Europeans and the Americans interact with the Middle East and Asia. That they are trying to interact with these places as colonial powers, never as equals. What are y'all saying in the chat? maybe those artifacts were never taken away. The nation in the Middle East would get the chance to properly take care of them and preserve them. Oh, absolutely. And there's a reason why. Like all of these the places where artifacts were taken from, by the way, all have made their case to the British Museum and to the Louvre, saying, "Hey, give us these things back. They were looted, taken out of our countries illegally." And what the British Museum and the Louvre will say is like, "No, they were not taken legally, and we're just not going to return them, period." They would, before this, by the way, they would try to make their case. They would be like, "Oh, you can't take care of them. You don't have the museums. You don't have the appropriate facilities." Once it became clear that that was not a good enough argument, they just flat out now just say, "No, we're not returning them, period." So this idea, though, of the way we view the Middle East and Asia hasn't disappeared. It's still largely viewed through this lens of racism, right? Like, let's think about up until really recently, right? There weren't a whole lot of examples of popular Asian American actors that could play multiple kinds of roles. How would we typically see an Asian in film and television? When they would appear in film and television, how would Asian Americans or Asians typically appear on television and film? Yeah, Emily?
Like caricatures. I feel like a lot of like older movies, especially, not even with just like Asian people, but with all people of color, they would use white actors as well and just kind of like mock and stereotype. So yeah.
Yeah, if you've ever watched Breakfast at Tiffany's, it's a classic movie beloved by so many people. And the Asian character is played by Mickey Rooney, by a white man. And it's totally a caricature, always with a thick accent. And always in kind of one smaller. You tended to not see like tall Asian American actors. No, always short. The women typically were meek, quiet, and presented as obedient. And the men as like ugly, thick accents, short, and like just total stereotypes, right? The total stereotypes. Or when you would see them and presented in a more positive light for Asian Americans, you might see Jackie Chan or Bruce Lee, right? And okay, those were not negative interpretations, negative representations of Asians. But what's the problem with the roles that Jackie Chan and Bruce Lee were given in Hollywood? Their characters are always doing martial arts, kung fu, these kinds of things. And they are not like they're playing essentially the same character over and over again. Right? It's a very limiting kind of box that Hollywood put these Asian actors in. Like, you are allowed to do this kind of movie and only this kind of movie. But as a result, then the image of Asian Americans and American culture has been that. So if you didn't grow up near Asian Americans or within an Asian American community, your whole idea of what it means to be Asian is through these movies. So it does end up having an impact, right? Now, what about the Middle East? How is the Middle Eastern men and women often represented in film and television? Terrorists. Yeah. Some of you, if you ever watch any of the shows from like the 90s and early 2000s, terrorism is a big plot point in a lot of TV shows. In fact, some TV shows completely centered around this idea of Middle Eastern terrorism, right? Shows like 24, and a bunch of other ones that were extremely popular. Some of them are still around. And that was like the only roles that men and women of Middle Eastern descent could get in Hollywood. I don't know. How much has that changed, do you think? I'll ask you guys. I don't watch enough television anymore to know how much. I watch enough films that I can see some things changing. But do you think things have changed a lot? Not enough? Yeah, Robert's actually making up an excellent point. Part of the reasoning why we get all these like terrorist shows was that Hollywood, in order to like use equipment, they use a lot of equipment from the military and from the Department of Defense. They are basically like the American government was dictating a lot of the themes that we got to see in film and television, because in order to film in places, use equipment, they had to give the Department of Defense kind of approval of the script. And not enough, right? We're starting to see the breakthrough of like the breaking down of some of these stereotypes in Asian Americans and Asian actors, right? There's a lot of recent examples of how more actors, more Asian American actors, and diversity in the roles that they're getting, but it's still kind of limited, still limited. I haven't seen a ton of movement, honestly, in terms of Middle East representation on film and television. Little bits here and there. You can maybe point to a few examples or more nuanced Middle Eastern characters in film and television, but largely not a ton. Not a ton. So anyway, so this idea is important, right? Because if this Orientalist idea of viewing people from the Middle East and Asia as other, as backwards, as lacking culture, or at least knowledge of their culture, their history, if this is already in existence, then it's gonna inform then how Chinese immigrants are treated in the United States when they first coming in large numbers, right? And one of the key things that we see with all immigrant groups, right, is the living patterns, how and where they're choosing to live, right? And it helps explain why we have Chinatowns in every major city in the world, right? The picture, sorry, my dog. The picture I have here is a picture of one of the most famous Chinatowns in San Francisco. When I went to San Francisco, you have to go take a picture in Chinatown. But I've been to Chinatown in Liverpool. When I went to Liverpool, my first trip abroad was Chinatown in Liverpool. Or it was in Liverpool, and we went to Chinatown. When my first trip to Paris, I lived right on the border between like Chinatown in the 13th arrondissement, and like all the signs, everything was in Chinese dialects. It was really cool actually to live near Chinatown in Paris. I've seen Chinatown in Mexico City, in Los Angeles, right? These Chinatowns everywhere. So how do these Chinatowns, these mini cities within a city, get created? Well, you get that first immigrant, that first group of immigrants coming from China, and let's say in San Francisco. And again, they need to find housing. That's one of the first things you need when you arrive in a new place. Where am I going to live? Well, they're for this wave of Chinese immigrants, because again, they're coming in and they're not coming in with money, right? These are poor immigrants. So they're going to try to find the cheapest housing available. So that's what the first wave of migrants are. It's going to choose to live cheapest possible housing. They also can't live. They're not going to be allowed to live in white neighborhoods, in white neighborhoods. So they're going to have to pick cheap housing outside of white neighborhoods. Well, okay, that first wave of immigrants come, and then they write back. They write back to family about, okay, how's it going? It's going well. You should come too. So the next wave of immigrants comes, and they're going to want to live near family members or near people who also come from China. Why? Why would they want to live near them? Language, right? One, language is a big deal, language, but also like common culture, common, so that you feel less alone, to build a community. Yes, Robert. Thank you. For same culture, same traditions. It makes the language issue so much easier when you're living around people who also don't speak English and you can communicate with. Right. And as these waves of immigrants keep doing, the pattern then evolves to the creation of Chinatowns. Now, very importantly, too, though, for these initial waves of Chinese immigrants, they're very quickly going to learn that they don't want to live in Black neighborhoods. What do you think is going to teach Chinese immigrants that they don't want to live in Black neighborhoods? They can't. They're not going to legally be allowed to live in white neighborhoods, but they're going to learn that they don't. They're going to be taught that they maybe don't want to live near Black neighborhoods. One, just by observation, by seeing how Black workers are treated, seeing how Black people are treated, right? And that was something that immigrants would experience and even talk about, right? One, they might be in competition for some of the same jobs with these workers. And so they're seeing them on a regular basis and they're learning. White people who are in charge, who are making the decisions about jobs, are treating Black people in this way as inferior. They get less pay, they don't get respected, they're not treated as equal. So part of that process means, they're also learning this anti-Blackness, racist attitudes, right? And as the Chinese community grows, then you can create your own community and you actually don't even need to worry about living near Black people. But that's part of the lesson that gets taught as immigrants come to the US. Okay, I'll stop here and we'll talk about why Chinese immigrants are coming to the US, like why are they leaving China and why they're coming to the US specifically, but we'll get to that on Thursday. I'll stop the recording here. Does anybody have any questions or comments?